Welcome back, everyone. So we are going to finish up this year by looking at, what remains. I would say the remaining content about mostly, let's see, word stress. So we're gonna finish up with word stress, looking at some more stress-imposing endings, right? The final sort of series, or it's smaller than a series, a final few, I should say, stress-imposing endings. And then we're going to look at an alternate, I would say, an alternative value. If you remember that I lay a lot of stress on the importance of knowing for each vowel the short, long, and R-colored and reduced value, right? And I wanted to call your attention to a sort of an alternative value for you. So we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at, finally, at consonants. We're going to look at an unusual thing, which is the nasal, the velar nasal, this sort of ing sound, right? And we've seen this briefly, but we haven't really systematically gone through it. So we're going to go through all three of these aspects in this video, and that will be the conclusion of the material that we will have learned this semester. So let's start with the question of word stress. Now, I will be following the brochure, which you all have, which will make things much simpler. And we are going to look on page 26. And on page 26, you will find a series of endings that sort of look similar, we would say. At the very top, we have word stress, right? And you'll notice we have a series of endings that begin with very similar letters, right? We have ius, uus, eel, right? It's important to see that those ones begin with I, and we have others at the end. Ian, ia, ear, iat, right? Then there are some that begin with e, ius in the middle, right? That you can find. And then there's one that begins with u, uus, right? So as we notice that some begin with I, some begin with E, and some begin with U, right? And that is why we can kind of sum them up, right, with this sort of a formula in which we have that first letter being either I, E, or U, and then they're followed by a vowel. That's what that plus V means. And then there's an optional vowel, because let's say, for example, if we have ia towards the end, there's only one vowel, right? But if we look at something like ius, right, I-O-U-S, we have more than one vowel, right? So that is to say that that's what that V in parentheses indicates, that in some of these endings, there may be one vowel after the I, E, or the U, and sometimes there may be two. And finally, we have the C in parentheses, which means that we have a consonant, an optional consonant. And we can use the same ending that we've just seen, the ia, right, the ia. We notice, of course, that it ends in a vowel, right? It doesn't end in a consonant. So this is to say that sometimes, right, and it's, to be honest, it's more exceptional, right? In a few cases, we may have this type of ending that does not end in a consonant, right? Whereas on most of them they do. With ius, that ends in an S, eel, that ends in an L, right? Okay, ium, that ends in an M, ian, that ends in an N, and so on, right? So it might be easier for you actually to sort of course, become familiar with a few of these endings, right? But it's sort of a shortcut to memorize that formula, because if you really know that formula, you're going to be able to recognize those endings when you see them. Great. And another thing too that I want to point out is that I've heard these referred to, some phoneticians refer to these as what they call ION type endings, because by the way, we've seen ION before, right? We've seen that when we had our list of endings that assign stress on the syllable before the ending, right? And by the way, this is on page 18. We went over this. On page 18 in the middle, we have, vision, decision, and we notice that ION assigns stress before. Now, of course, ION can be described by the same formula. This isn't said in the brochure, but I think it's important for you to be aware of this, right? Because I is the first letter. Meaning it's either I, E, or U. Then we have O is the following vowel. There is no optional other vowel. We only have one, which is O. And then we have a consonant N, I-O-N. So that is why very often right? You might, it's good to be familiar with the fact that these type of endings might be called ION type of endings because ION is the most common one, right? Okay. And also with ION type endings, they obey the same, they have the same rule, meaning the endings, right? Here we're talking about stress imposing endings, right? Just to remind you, there are three types of stress imposing endings. There are those that assign stress on the final syllable, right? Well, we're not going to go much farther. We'll just say that there are stress imposing endings that assign on the final, and then stress imposing endings that assign stress before the ending, right? And so here we can say, yes, these behave exactly like ION because we learned ION in the series of endings that assign stress before the ending, right? So these behave we can just think of them in sort of variations of that, right? And that's pretty all. And so that's pretty much it. And we can see them in a few examples. For example, here we have precious, continuous, official. And if you hear that, we have precious, that would be 1-O stress pattern. Continuous, right? Okay, that would be O1, O-O. Notice that uus, that'll be two syllables there, but it is before the O-U, O-U-S. So sometimes this ending might, in the case of uus, right, actually take up two syllables, but it's mostly they only take one. But in either case, the stress falls before the ending, and that is what we call the rule for the ending. Great. So that's that. And I would suggest, for example, in your brochure on page 26, where we have seen this, and you can practice examples there, and you can try to identify them. I would suggest that you make a note to page 18, right? And you might do the same thing on page 18 to say that with ION to say, be aware of those ION type endings on page 26, and on page 26 you can say, oh yes, this is sort of an extension of what we already learned with ION, right? So that's one thing, right? That is our first element of concerning stress pattern, right? Another thing to be aware of, and this is the final thing we're going to see concerning stress pattern, is going to be an ending that is known as ibble and igible. So now we are going to turn to page 21. Okay, we're on page 21 here. And you can see them here. We have our ibble, igible, right? The reason we kind of look at these together is that you might fail to notice igible if you see ibble. For example, in a sense, we can say that igible contains ibble, right? Okay, but think of igible being sort of a big shark, and think of ibble being a smaller fish, and you can think of igible just eating up ibble, which means that if there is igible, ibble will have no effect, right? It takes precedence, right? So, and in both cases, right, both of these endings will assign stress on the syllable before the ending, right? So we can sort of hear this in a if we look at a few words, here we have irresistible, right? Irresistible, the stress pattern of that will be 2-O-1-O-O, right? Irresistible, irresistible. Then we have destructible, destructible, O-1-O-O, right? Okay. Dirigible, that's kind of a very rare word that I rarely use, but we would say dirigible, 1-O-O-O. That's really all there is to say. That is the last thing we're going to see. You can look at those exercises. And I would also point to your attention on page 34. There is a very helpful, I've already given you a handout on this, but what might help you is the sort of an overview of all these endings, right? When we look at stress imposing endings, by the way, in which there's a friendly reminder of our neutral endings, right, that we've spent some time looking at, right, which of course have our meaning. That I'm very impressed with the fact that you've all been very good about actually, really knowing that definition as well as you can, namely that neutral endings are never stressed and they never affect the stress pattern. And we talked about transparent derivation. It was pretty interesting, and you're really good with understanding that. So it's important it's convenient, I think, to have these things together on the same page, right? And that will hopefully help you not confuse neutral endings on the one hand, right, that we see in the top here, and we have a list, and they work differently, right? And then we have our stress imposing endings, which are often sometimes referred to as strong endings, right? Okay, think of them as strong because they are powerful. They do affect the stress pattern, which is the opposite, right, of what the neutral endings do. The neutral endings never do. The stress imposing endings do almost all the time, unless there's an exception, right? So that's pretty much it. And what is kind of helpful is you can kind of practice using this. I like these exercises. I think are really good on page 34 and 35, right? Try to look at the way cynical and engineer are done, and you can perhaps do those. And if you want to send those to me, that would be great. I'd willingly correct those. I think next week I will send you a sort of a correction of that, so that you can be sure that you're sort of on track. So that's all. That's it. I hope that this is pretty clear. I think you're pretty square on these. I'm glad we got the chance to do a quiz before everyone's sequestration. So you seem to be doing pretty well with that. So make sure that you follow this through to the end. And then finally, next we're going to look at vowels, right? And we are going to look on page 25, right? We're going to look at what might be considered to be sort of an optional or sort of an alternative short value for you. So hopefully you can see this on page 25 here. So notice this is the transcription is this funky U symbol, right? That looks like I think this is used for, if you're studying electronics, it's sort of like an upside down ohm symbol, right? You might have seen it in that way. So we have our sort of wavy U symbol here, right? Okay. And the thing to notice that this is studied in comparison with the long value for U, right? Which we write with that diacritic afterwards, right? Where we might have a yod before because that we might have that sharp E sound, right? For example, like cute, right? We can hear that tense, and that's a consonant, right? Okay, the cute, right? Which the yod, of course, occurs in most of the time when we have the long value, but it never does if we have R and L. Like I say rule, I don't say rule, I don't say, or if I Luke, I don't say Luke, right? Otherwise, we're mostly, in most cases, going to have it, especially when we have the letter U. But I don't want to go into an extensive review of the long value for U, but what I do want to say is, yes, you are all familiar with the short value, which is the sort of, which we indicate with the sort of circumflex, right? And here's our long value. And I would say in the middle, we have this sort of other value, which I think you can think of it as sort of an alternate short value for U. Okay. So notice we have the short value, which is sort of that duller sound. It's a laxer vowel, right? Okay, or our muscles are less tense. It's not so very far from the schwa, which is the middle, the right? So it's fairly central, right? Whereas with the U, we're on the sort of periphery, right? So it's a tenser vowel, right? And we talked about the fact that we're not tense in the beginning, we get tense towards the end. You, right? You. And you kind of move your, especially because we have this yod in the beginning, right? When we practice, we became aware of the fact that we move our mouth a lot, right? And also, when we move our mouth to make the long value, right, we really round our lips, right? And we kind of stick our lips out. And if you really look at someone saying it, you can kind of play the game. I'm using the camera here. You can do this in the mirror if you'd like. You can see it. You kind of extend your lips, right? And they kind of pucker out, kind of abruptly at the end. You, right? You really push them out, right? So. And of course, with because the short value, right, is a lax vowel, there is none of this tensioning, right? There is none of this sort of puckering up. So you're gonna say them almost in the same way that you would say like right? You kind of pull back a little bit with the lower jaw, right? But it's minor. Okay. So we have like cut for the short value, cut, and then we could say like cute for the long value. Okay. Now. With the alternative value, it's sort of in between as far as what we do with tenseness in our lips. We just said that the long value was we rounded our lips are rounded, right? Whereas with the alternate short value, we have sort of what we call semi-rounded lips. And the way to sort of understand that might start with right, or right? And then go ooh. And you notice you kind of you progressively extend your lips on sort of a gradient, right? And if you stop halfway, well, I say halfway, I mean, that's not exact, but at some point towards the middle, right? Going from sort of or to ooh, right? while you're extending your lips, you're going to get in a sort of intermediary zone, and that's going to be the right? Right? So it's think of it being sort of like halfway between the or the and the I don't know if that helps you very much. We always kind of do our best. It's a little bit of a difficult sound to approximate, right? And I think the best thing, of course, to do is to say, well, where do we see this? Well, there's a series of words that we might look at. That I usually do is there's sort of like a word play that we can do if you can sort of think of putting an object somewhere. Notice I can say put. Let's say you have a bag. I put my object in a bag. And that sound right? It's not it's not it's sort of halfway between those two, right? So I put something in my bag and then it's full. And even though the L in the final position, right? That will, and the coda of the vowel, that will alter that sound. It is still the same sound. So I put something in my bag and then it's full. Okay, right? And then it's full. And I can, let's say if I'm leaning against the wall, I'm pushing, right? I'm pushing on the wall. And then if instead of pushing, the opposite of pushing, of course, is to pull, which is just like full, right? And now we can be kind of silly. And then we can talk about the president before Obama was Bush, right? We have that, right? And that's, of course, the proper noun. But here, this would be like the word, also that's the proper noun, the common noun, right? Which, of course, where we wouldn't have the capital would be like un buisson, an arbuste, that would be a bush, right? Okay. And we could be